Hello, my name is Dr. Yasir Khebar from Department of Neurosurgery. I am resident level 5 working at Yasir National Hospital, Karachi, Pakistan. Today I am going to talk regarding the cerebral anatomy of the frontal and the parietal lobes. So when we are talking about the anatomy generally, we know that there are two cerebral hemispheres and they are divided by the midline longitudinal fissure within which the falx cerebri runs. And then again, hemispheres have got various surfaces, margins, poles, various lobes that we are going to talk about. So this is a picture which is showing the lateral surface of the cerebral hemisphere. Within this you can appreciate the frontal lobe, and then we have the central sulcus, behind which we have got the parietal lobe. Then we have got the occipital lobe and the temporal lobe. So this is briefly the lateral surface of the cerebral hemisphere. This picture demonstrates the anterior view of the cerebral hemisphere. When talking about the various poles that cerebral hemisphere has got, it has got three poles. One is the frontal pole, which can be seen in this picture. This is the frontal pole, and then we have got the temporal pole as well. And the other one that can be seen in the posterior view is the occipital pole. So this picture demonstrates the occipital pole of the cerebral hemisphere. So we have three poles, and frontal, occipital and the temporal pole, and we have again three surfaces. One of them was the lateral surface, the other one is the basal surface or the inferior surface, which is being shown in this picture, and the third one is the medial surface of the cerebral hemisphere. Then if we talk about the borders, we again have got three borders. One of them is the superior border. So this is the superior border along which the superior sagittal sinus is actually running, and then we have got a medial border which can be seen in this picture as well. So this is where the medial border runs. We have got the medial border of the frontal lobe, and behind we have got the medial border of the occipital lobe as well, and then we have got a lateral border as well that can be seen in the picture on the lateral surface. So here this border that runs downward is the lateral border. So regarding the three types of white fibers, we have got the commissural fibers, we have got the association fibers, and we have got the projection fibers. So let's go in detail regarding the anatomy of the frontal lobe and parietal lobe specifically. Now, as you can all appreciate in this picture, which is the picture of the lateral hemispheric surface, we can clearly appreciate the lateral surface of the brain, and we can also see the sagittal sinus. So this blue colored structure that is running over the top is the sagittal sinus, and this is where the superior border of the hemisphere also lies. On this surface we can appreciate the frontal lobe and the parietal lobe. Now, what is the distinction between the frontal and parietal lobe? It is this cleft that is running in the center. This sulcus is the one that differentiates from the frontal lobe anteriorly from the parietal lobe posteriorly. This sulcus is known as the central sulcus. In this picture I have further highlighted the central sulcus with the green color. So you can see that the central sulcus runs all the way from the superior border, but does not open downwards into this another sulcus that can be appreciated over here, this sulcus. See, there is a small gyral bridge that does not let the central sulcus open within this sulcus. This horizontal sulcus is actually the sylvian fissure. So two main sulci that can be appreciated on the lateral surface are the central sulcus and the horizontal sulcus, which is known as the sylvian sulcus. This is the picture highlighting the sylvian fissure or the sylvian sulcus. Sylvian fissure is not a simple cleft on the surface. It's actually a very deep fissure. If we retract the frontal and the temporal lobe by applying retractors in this region and to retract these temporal and frontal lids away, we can appreciate that sylvian fissure is actually a deep compartment consisting of superficial deep compartments. Again, within the deep compartment we have got opercular insular compartment and the sylvian cistern itself. So this fissure actually extends medially, going all the way across the sphenoid wing till the carotid cisterns most medially. And then on the surface again, sylvian fissure has got various boundaries and various rami, various branches that are important to understand. One of them is this branch here. There's an anterior horizontal and anterior ascending branch of the sylvian fissure. This one, this sulci is known as the anterior horizontal ramus, and this one is known as the anterior ascending ramus. In between these two rami, there's a triangular gyrus that can be appreciated over here. I will later on name it as pars triangularis, which is a part of the inferior frontal gyrus itself. And then this behind the anterior ascending rami, another part of the inferior frontal gyrus can be appreciated. This part of the inferior frontal gyrus is pars opercularis, and in between the anterior horizontal ramus and the orbital plate or the floor of the or the roof of the orbit, we can appreciate the pars orbitalis. So we have these three. This whole gyrus together is known as the inferior frontal gyrus, and it has further three parts: pars orbitalis, pars triangularis, and pars opercularis, divided by two rami arising from the sylvian fissure. This inferior frontal gyrus has another importance in relation to the pars opercularis and pars triangularis, and this is that Broca's area, that is the motor speech area, is actually residing within these areas. So moving on to the next picture. In this picture, a sulcus anterior to the central sulcus has been highlighted. As we previously described, this was the central sulcus. Now this sulcus runs vertically just anterior to it. This is the precentral sulcus, and now this is the sulcus which is posterior to the central sulcus, and this one is the postcentral sulcus. Anterior to the central sulcus, this gyrus, which is a part of the frontal lobe, as we previously discussed that anterior to the central sulcus, this whole lobe is the frontal lobe, and behind the central sulcus, this whole lobe is the parietal lobe. So this gyrus which runs anterior to the central sulcus is the precentral gyrus, and this one which runs behind the central sulcus is the postcentral gyrus, and postcentral gyrus is a part of the parietal lobe. So in this picture, the Rutan has highlighted entire frontal lobe other than the precentral gyrus. This precentral gyrus is also a part of the frontal lobe, and this is the entire frontal lobe being highlighted. Now on the lateral surface, what are the various sulci and gyri that are present within the frontal lobe? There are three sulci that divide the frontal lobe on the lateral surface. One of them we previously studied was the precentral sulcus. In between the central sulcus and precentral sulcus, we have got the precentral gyri running. That's one part of the frontal lobe. The other two sulci that are present on the lateral surface are the superior frontal sulcus and the inferior frontal sulcus. So this is the line where the superior frontal sulcus runs, and just above it, this yellow highlighted structure is the superior frontal gyrus, and then beneath it we have here the inferior frontal sulcus running. And so in between the inferior and superior frontal sulcus, we have got the middle frontal gyrus, and then finally in between the inferior frontal sulcus and the sylvian sulcus, we have got the inferior frontal gyrus, of which there are three parts we previously discussed: pars orbitalis, triangularis, and opercularis. Pars opercularis is called pars opercularis because it actually forms a opercula, which means a lid, a covering of this sylvian cistern or sylvian fissure. This pars opercularis is named that. So pars orbitalis is called orbitalis because it's lying over the orbital roof, and triangularis is triangular in shape with its apex directed downwards. So this picture highlights the middle frontal gyrus part of the frontal lobe, and in this picture inferior frontal gyrus has been highlighted. This is the precentral gyrus. So this was regarding the frontal lobe. We appreciated superior, middle, inferior frontal gyrus and the precentral gyrus. Now about the parietal lobe, which originates behind the central sulcus. This vertically oriented gyrus is the postcentral gyrus, and then there are two other gyrus is within the parietal lobe on the lateral surface. These are superior parietal lobule and the inferior parietal lobule. These are further divided by a horizontally running sulcus over here where my red arrow is. It's known as intraparietal sulcus. This intraparietal sulcus runs just parallel to the superior border and divides into a superior parietal lobule superiorly and inferior parietal lobule inferiorly. This inferior parietal lobule is further divided into two parts depending on the sulci over which it is hanging. Like if the part of the inferior parietal lobule that is wrapping around this sylvian fissure, you see my marker is following the sylvian fissure and its posterior end is turned upwards within this inferior parietal lobule, and this gyrus that is overhanging the posterior limit of the sylvian fissure is the supramarginal gyrus. While if you follow this sulcus within the temporal lobe, this sulcus is known as the superior temporal sulcus and it's also going within this inferior parietal lobule. The part of the inferior parietal lobule that is overhanging this superior temporal sulcus is the angular gyrus. So in the inferior parietal lobule we have got the supramarginal gyrus anteriorly and the angular gyrus slightly posteriorly. The importance of these two areas is that the Wernicke's area, which is the main area for sensory control of the voice, sensory aphasia, is present in these areas, the Wernicke area, and in the associated part of the superior temporal lobe as well. Whereas the Broca's area, which was the motor speech area, is located in the pars triangularis and pars opercularis. Now here another important concept has been highlighted. You can see that the central sulcus does not open all the way within the sylvian fissure, but there is a small gyral bridge that is not letting central sulcus open within the sylvian fissure. This gyral bridge is known as the subcentral gyrus. So precentral gyrus and postcentral gyrus are actually communicating via this subcentral gyrus, and this is one of the identification of the central sulcus. When you are doing a limited frontotemporal craniotomies, you can identify the central sulcus by this method, that it does not open all the way down into the sylvian fissure, but this subcentral gyrus prevents it from opening down into the sylvian fissure. Another way to identify, or another method to identify the central sulcus on a craniotomy, is that if you trace from anterior to the posterior, most anteriorly you have got pars opercularis, followed by which you have a precentral, then you have a postcentral gyrus, and postcentral gyrus is also appearing to communicate with the supramarginal gyrus. If you can see that anterior bank of the supramarginal gyrus communicates with the postcentral gyrus, the posterior bank of supramarginal gyrus communicates with the angular gyrus. So see, actually the gyri are communicating, it's not an absolute division itself. So in this picture has been taken from the Greenberg's 9th edition. It shows various methods to localize the motor strip and the central sulcus with the help of the Taylor-Horton lines. In this picture we have drawn a line from nasion to the inion. So this is the nasoinial line. One of the methods is that if you go from external auditory meatus straight up, that's where your motor strip actually lies. Another method is to mark the midpoint of the nasoinian line, and you can go 2 cm behind, that's your 1 point. Another point would be a line drawn from the condylar line to the point where it cuts the sylvian fissure line, and then you approximate these two lines, and this line represents the central sulcus, and just anterior to it you have your motor strip. How do we mark the sylvian fissure? We take a line from the mid of the lateral orbital margin and we go to the nasoinial lines 3/4 quarter, and this marks the sylvian fissure. The third method to identify the central sulcus is that you go from posterior ear line to the tip of the vertex and then join it with the sylvian fissure. And the fourth method is you take a reed space line, which is a line running from the lower inferior orbital margin to the mid of the external auditory meatus, and then take a line at a 45 degree to this reed space line, and that line when starting at the pterion actually points in the direction of the central sulcus. So these are various methods to localize the central sulcus when you're doing a craniotomy. Then the concept of the central lobes come into play. The central lobe is actually a concept given by Raton in which the precentral gyrus along with the postcentral gyrus are together called the central lobe. And these precentral and postcentral gyrus, as you can appreciate in this picture, actually continue on the medial surface of the cerebral hemisphere as well as the paracentral lobule that we will be later on talking in detail about. So what's the significance of the precentral gyrus and the postcentral gyrus? The precentral gyrus is your primary motor area, and the postcentral gyrus is your primary somatosensory area. The primary motor area controls all the functions of your body. This is from where the giant pyramidal cells of the bats give rise to the corticospinal tracts. So this is a picture of the homunculus, which in Latin means a little man, because there's a diagrammatic representation of little man all along the surface of the cerebral hemisphere, and this is actually the representation within the primary motor area. And also there's a sensory homunculus in which there's representation of the primary sensory area. So in this one we can appreciate that various parts of body can be represented, and depending on how much part of the cortex has been attributed to a specific part of body, the pictures have been drawn accordingly. Like you can see that there's a large area of the cerebral cortex dedicated to the control of the hand. That's why we have got fine motor control within the hands, and large area of the motor cortex are again given to the facial area as well, whereas the trunk has got relatively lower portion. Another thing of importance over here is the medial representation of the structure. We can see on the medial surface we have the representation of the lower extremities, we have the representation of the genitalia as well. So if the medial surface is involved by a lesion, the contralateral hemiparesis would involve the lower limb and the loss of the sphincter or defecatory controls. So again, this is the primary motor cortex located within the precentral gyrus and the primary sensory cortex located within the postcentral gyrus, the representation. Then another important functional area is the premotor area. This area is located just anterior to the precentral gyrus. This is our precentral gyrus, and just anterior to it, in the posterior part of the middle and inferior frontal gyrus, a part of pars opercularis as well, is the premotor area. The function of premotor area is the programming of the fine motor activities. So actually within our brain, all the activities are programmed, and then this program initiates a complex range of motions. So this programming of motor activity, this planning of motor activity occurs in this premotor area. Now, within the parietal lobe, this portion I already described in detail. The part of the inferior parietal lobule that is actually encircling the posterior margin of the sylvian fissure is the supramarginal gyrus. So again, this picture from Raton has got various structures labeled. Pars orbitalis, pars triangularis, opercularis, all of them can be seen labeled over here. We have got the inferior frontal sulcus. In between the inferior frontal and superior frontal sulcus, we have got middle frontal gyrus, superior frontal gyrus. We have got the precentral gyrus within the frontal lobe. The sylvian fissure demarcates the frontal lobe from the temporal lobe, and the central sulcus demarcates the frontal lobe from the parietal lobe. Behind the central sulcus, we have got the postcentral gyrus, and then we have got the superior and the inferior parietal lobule. Within the inferior parietal lobule, we have got supramarginal gyrus anteriorly. This is the supramarginal gyrus. And then over the superior temporal sulcus, we have got the angular gyrus posteriorly. The demarcation between the parietal and occipital lobe on the lateral surface is by an imaginary line. There's a sulcus we are going to discuss on the medial surface of the cerebral hemisphere known as the parieto-occipital sulcus. There's a continuation of it posteriorly over here on the lateral surface, and we draw a line straight downward from this continuation of the parieto-occipital sulcus to the pre-occipital notch, and we join this line. This imaginary line actually demarcates the parietal lobe from the occipital lobe. So in this picture, the author has actually excised a portion of the superior frontal gyrus and the middle frontal gyrus. You can see that the precentral gyrus has been left intact, but the middle and inferior frontal gyrus have been excised. And when he has excised these structures, we can see that the inferior frontal sulcus actually coordinates or collaborates with the level of the lower part of corpus callosum. So this is the corpus callosum, and we can see the lower margin of the corpus callosum lies at the level of the inferior frontal sulcus. And also in the picture we can see the lateral ventricle just beginning to start behind the inferior frontal gyrus. The cingulate sulcus can be appreciated on this picture as too, and you can see that cingulate sulcus would lie at the level where the superior frontal sulcus would actually lie. So superior frontal sulcus collaborates with the cingulate sulcus, and the inferior frontal sulcus lies at the level of the inferior margin of the corpus callosum, or the callosal sulcus in other words. Okay, within this picture the falx cerebri can be appreciated. We have excised one lobe completely, and this is the falx cerebri, and behind it we can appreciate the medial surface of the contralateral hemisphere. So if we further dissect it out, we will see in the next pictures what will happen. In this picture another concept has been shown, is that behind posteriorly we can see this is the postcentral gyrus, and we have excised the supramarginal gyrus part of the parietal lobe, and beneath it lies this part of the ventricle that is known as the atrium. So atrium actually lies deep to the supramarginal gyrus, whereas deep to the inferior frontal gyrus we have got the lateral ventricles body and the frontal horns. The foramen of Monro, which is where the communication occurs between the two lateral ventricles and the third ventricle, actually lies at the center of the pars opercularis, and also within the insula it lies at the level of the second short insular gyrus midpoint. So this is actually when we are talking about relationship between the deep and the superficial structures that these come into play. Now this picture demonstrates the lateral surface of the whole frontal lobe has been highlighted. In this picture the parietal lobe in its entirety has been highlighted. This is the same picture, so we are just going to move on. Now this picture has been taken from the front, so this is the frontal pole that can be appreciated. In the midline we have got the superior sagittal sinus. We can appreciate various dilated venous channels on both sides of the superior sagittal sinus. These dilated venous channels are the lacunae, and we have got the superior frontal gyrus, then we have got the middle frontal gyrus, and inferior frontal gyrus will come over here somewhere. We can see that various venous channels that are draining into the superior sagittal sinus actually are running backward, in a backward direction when looked from the front. This is a picture that has been taken posteriorly from behind. So the occipital pole of the cerebral hemisphere can be appreciated. These are the occipital lobes, and then these are the parietal lobes. You can very clearly see the superior parietal lobule and the inferior parietal lobule, and they have been divided in between by a intraparietal sulcus. In this picture you can appreciate that the venous channels are actually running in a forward direction to drain within the superior sagittal sinus. Another important structure in this picture is this torcula. This is the torcula heterofly, which is also known as the confluence of sinuses, where in this picture sagittal sinus and thoracic sinus from both sides are meeting in the midline. Moving on, we have the medial hemispheric surface, which now we are going to talk about. Within the medial hemispheric surface, this is the dissection we are continuing from the previous picture. This shows the frontal horn and the atrium, and the temporal horn of the lateral ventricle has been shown to reside within the temporal lobe. So if we further dissect it away, we remove the falx cerebri, we can now appreciate the medial surface of the cerebral hemisphere. So within this medial surface of the cerebral hemisphere, there are various structures. Again, we have to divide it in between the frontal lobe and the parietal lobe. So the most important structure to divide it is this structure. This is the paracentral lobule. And why is it important? Because this paracentral lobule is actually the continuation of the precentral gyrus and the postcentral gyrus on the medial surface. You see, the precentral postcentral gyrus on the lateral surface continue medially as this single paracentral lobule, and also the central sulcus continues for a brief distance over here. And from that central sulcus, if we draw a straight line downward to the corpus callosum, then the portion anterior to this line is the frontal lobe, and the portion behind this line would be the parietal lobe. So the extension of the central sulcus, from that extension you have to draw a line straight downward to the corpus callosum. The portion anterior to it is frontal, behind it is parietal lobe. So what have we got in the portion that is anterior to it? that is the frontal lobe. We have got the continuation of the superior frontal gyrus. We have got the part of the cingulate gyrus. The part of cingulate gyrus that is anterior to the continuation of central sulcus is in the frontal lobe. The part behind is a part of the parietal lobe. And then behind this paracentral lobule, we have got another part which is the continuation of the supramarginal gyrus on the medial surface. This continuation of the supramarginal gyrus on the medial surface is known as precuneus. This is a part of the parietal lobe. And then this is the occipital lobe. I'm not going into its detail, but just one thing I'm going to tell you is this fissure, this is the parieto-occipital fissure or parieto-occipital sulcus that I previously told you continues on the lateral surface for a brief distance. This parieto-occipital sulcus meets with the calcarine sulcus in a Y-shaped configuration, and beneath the parieto-occipital sulcus, this whole part is the occipital lobe, and it separates the parietal and occipital lobe on the medial surface. So this is another picture which shows the dissection. The falx cerebri can be appreciated in the midline in this picture. Again, various structures can be appreciated. We have already discussed this. So let's discuss this picture in a little bit of detail. So in this picture, you can only appreciate the medial surface of the cerebral hemisphere. The paracentral lobule can be identified over here. The paracentral lobule, which is the continuation of the precentral gyrus and postcentral gyrus, is bounded posteriorly by this ascending marginal ramus. This is the continuation of the cingulate sulcus. So if we trace it from here, you can see that this is the corpus callosum, which forms the innermost layer of the medial surface. This is the innermost roll of the medial surface. Over the corpus callosum, we have got another layer, this layer of the gyri. This gyri is known as the cingulate gyrus, which lies just over the corpus callosum. And then the third layer is these gyri in continuation. This third layer is actually made up of superior frontal gyrus anteriorly. Then we have got the paracentral lobule in this third layer. And finally, we have got the precuneus in this third layer, continuing behind into the occipital lobe. So there are three layers of the medial surface that we just discussed: corpus callosum, cingulate gyrus, and then the layer of superior frontal gyrus, paracentral lobule, and the precuneus. These three layers are separated from each other by various sulci. The sulcus that is separating the corpus callosum from the cingulate gyrus is known as the callosal sulcus, and the sulcus that is separating the cingulate gyrus from the superior frontal gyrus is known as the cingulate sulcus. So this structure is the cingulate sulcus, and it continues posteriorly to form a branch known as the ascending ramus of the cingulate sulcus, also known as the ascending marginal ramus of the cingulate sulcus. And this ascending marginal ramus forms the posterior boundary of the paracentral lobule. The anterior boundary is formed by the paracentral sulcus. So paracentral lobule is bounded anteriorly by the paracentral sulcus, inferiorly by the cingulate sulcus, posteriorly by the ascending ramus of the cingulate sulcus. The cingulate sulcus does not terminate over here, but it continues posteriorly to give way to another sulcus in this region that is known as subparietal sulcus. So if you look at this picture, you can see this cingulate sulcus more clearly. You can see the ascending ramus of the cingulate sulcus, anterior to which is the paracentral lobule, and you can see this continuation of the cingulate sulcus behind as well. And this continuation is known as the subparietal sulcus part of the cingulate sulcus. So this subparietal sulcus actually forms a boundary of precuneus. Precuneus is bounded anteriorly by the ascending ramus, inferiorly by the subparietal sulcus, and posteriorly by the parieto-occipital sulcus. So parieto-occipital sulcus, it separates the occipital lobe from the parietal lobe, and it forms the boundary of the cuneus, which is a part of the occipital lobe. We are not discussing this structure in detail today. Another important structure that can be identified on this picture is the para-olfactory gyrus and the paraterminal gyrus. Paraterminal gyrus is called so because it lies beside the lamina terminalis. Para-olfactory gyrus lies beside the olfactory striate, that's why they are named so. They are located just beneath the rostrum of the corpus callosum. See, this is the corpus callosum. We have got the genu, and then we have got the rostrum of corpus callosum forming the anterior wall and the floor of the frontal horn.
Just beneath this rostrum of corpus callosum, we have got the para-olfactory gyrus and the paraterminal gyrus. Paraterminal gyrus goes on to continue with a thin layer of gray matter in this region that is known as indicium gryzium that continues within the callosal sulcus, and the para-olfactory gyrus lies just anterior to this paraterminal gyrus. So these two are again part of the frontal lobe on the medial surface. The other part is this part. This is the superior frontal gyrus, continuation on the medial surface. Then we have got the paracentral lobule, which is a continuation of precentral and postcentral gyrus. Then we have got the precuneus, which is the continuation of the superior parietal lobule on the medial surface. So again, in this structure, you can appreciate the cingulate sulcus, the ascending ramus, the paracentral sulcus, the subparietal sulcus forming one boundary of the precuneus. The same structure. So I'm just going to skip these pictures. Now within this picture, the relationship between the deep and superficial structures, between the medial and the lateral structures has been shown. That how are structures on the lateral surface of cerebral hemisphere related to the structures on the medial surface. You can see this yellow colored dotted line in this picture. This line is actually a representation of the central sulcus on the medial surface. This is where the central sulcus lies on the lateral surface. So you can see that this is the paracentral lobule, and this is running just in between the paracentral lobule because the continuation of pre and post central gyrus. And then we also have got various other structures over here that have been represented like these yellow colored structures, which is a representation of the chordate nucleus on this surface. So again, the central sulcus line has been highlighted. Now this green structure that has been highlighted on this picture is the callosal sulcus I described earlier. This is the superior frontal gyrus, so this one would be the callosal gyrus, and above it we have got the callosal sulcus. In between the superior frontal gyrus and the callosal gyrus, we have got the callosal sulcus. Oh, sorry. This is the cingulate gyrus, and this is the superior frontal gyrus. In between the superior frontal gyrus and the cingulate gyrus, we have got the cingulate sulcus. Sorry, this is the cingulate sulcus that has been highlighted, and this cingulate sulcus is actually running between the superior frontal gyrus and the cingulate gyrus on the medial surface. So now the author here is highlighted the paracentral lobule in question. So this is the paracentral lobule being highlighted. In this picture, the paracentral sulcus, which forms the anterior part or anterior wall of the paracentral lobule, has been highlighted. The posterior wall, the posterior boundary of the paracentral lobule, that is actually the ascending marginal ramus part of the cingulate sulcus, has been highlighted. So if we look at the radiology, in this axial section of the MRI FLAIR image, we can identify this pars marginalis, or the ascending ramus of the marginal gyrus. You can see this is the pars marginalis, and it forms a bracket-like sign on the MRI on both sides of the interhemispheric fissure. So this bracket-like sign, pars bracket or pars marginalis, can be identified with the help of this. Just anterior to the pars marginalis lies the central sulcus. So here you can see that this sulcus that is extending all the way to the midline but does not touch the midline, just stops before touching the midline, is the central sulcus. So within the pars bracket, there lies the central sulcus, and what lies anterior to the central sulcus is the precentral gyrus, which is the motor strip or the primary motor area. So this is the way to identify the motor area on an axial MRI image. If you identify pars bracket, anterior to it you have got the central sulcus, and just anterior to it you have got the motor strip. You can also appreciate an inverted omega sign over here. This inverted omega sign represents the hand knob area. Why it is called hand knob area? Because in the middle portion of the motor strip, in this portion, there is representation of the hand, as we previously appreciated on an homunculus. So the alpha axons of the upper motor neurons of the control of the hand are originating from this region. So that's why it's known as hand knob. Another important structure that can be appreciated here is this POCS, which is the parieto-occipital sulcus, that can be appreciated here. Now, this is the medial surface of the cerebral hemisphere, and the highlighted structure is the corpus callosum. This is the cingulate gyrus being highlighted. In between the corpus callosum and cingulate gyrus, we have got the sulcus, which is known as the callosal sulcus. Now, this sulcus is the cingulate sulcus, which has been highlighted. The cingulate sulcus has got an anterior continuation, which is the ascending marginal ramus or the pars marginalis, and posteriorly its continuation is the subparietal sulcus. This is the parieto-occipital sulcus, which separates the parietal lobe from the occipital lobe on the medial surface. Again, this is the parieto-occipital sulcus. This view is taken posteriorly. We have applied a retractor and retracting sagittal sinus on the one side. We are retracting away the cerebral hemisphere on the other side, and we can appreciate this parieto-occipital sulcus. This is the occipital lobe, and this is the parietal lobe. Medially, this is the precuneus. You can see that the calcarine sulcus and parieto-occipital sulcus meet together to form a Y-shaped configuration, and in between this Y is the cuneus. So the part anterior to it is labeled as precuneus. The other part of the occipital lobe on the medial surface is lingula. We are not going into its detail right now. So this is the paracentral review we already discussed. This is the precuneus part of the parietal lobe that has been highlighted. Anteriorly, it is bounded by the ascending marginal ramus, posteriorly by the parieto-occipital sulcus, inferiorly by the subparietal sulcus. Superiorly, it is continuous with the superior parietal lobule across the superior border. So relationships between the medial and lateral surfaces. So here you can appreciate the corpus callosum being highlighted via the black dots. This is the region where the corpus callosum is running in the deep surface. This green marker actually highlights the level of the foramen of Monro. The yellow marker highlights the level of the pineal gland, and this white marker highlights the level of lamina terminalis. There are three arrows also showing three important sulci that continue from medial surface onto the lateral surface. This white arrow is where the pars marginalis is located. Ascending ramus of the pars marginalis is present. This red arrow is actually at the level of the parieto-occipital sulcus, and then this yellow is at the level of the calcarine sulcus. So again, in this picture, various sulci that are present on the medial surface have been depicted on the lateral surface. You can see the cingulate sulcus superiorly being drawn. This cingulate sulcus is actually correlating with the inferior frontal sulcus on the lateral surface. And then you have got the depiction of the caudate nucleus as well, foramen of Monro, pineal gland, and also the depiction of parieto-occipital sulcus. And like if the parieto-occipital sulcus is drawn on the lateral surface, where would it lie? Here is where it would lie. So again, this picture shows the drawing of various structures on the medial surface when they are present on the lateral surface. You can see the central sulcus. We had previously discussed this picture as well, and you can see the point of the Sylvian point and the circular sulcus of the insula. We have not studied insula in detail right now. So the circular sulcus is actually the sulcus which surrounds the insula. So the author has just shown that where the circular sulcus of the insula would lie. Okay, so this picture shows the basal hemispheric surface. So now we are talking about the final surface, the inferior surface of the cerebral hemisphere. So this is the basal hemispheric surface of the frontal lobe. We can see that the basal hemispheric surface of the frontal lobe is divided into various gyri by this structure. Now this structure is actually the olfactory sulcus, and it gives home to this olfactory tract which runs within it. So on the basal surface of the frontal lobe, this olfactory sulcus or the olfactory tract divides into a medial portion and then a large lateral portion. This medial portion is a small straight gyrus that is known as the gyrus rectus part of the frontal lobe. The remaining portion is actually the orbital gyrus, which is further divided by an H-shaped sulcus So this is one limb of H, this is the straight limb or transverse limb, and this is the other limb of H. So an H-shaped circle configuration divides this large orbital gyri into anterior orbital gyri, the lateral orbital gyri, the posterior orbital gyri, and the medial orbital gyri. The medial orbital gyri are bounded medially by the olfactory tract and laterally by the vertical strut of this H-shaped orbital circus. So this is what lies within the floor or within the basal surface of the frontal lobe. The parietal lobe has not got any basal surface. It has got only two surfaces, the medial and the lateral surface, whereas the frontal lobe has got this third surface we just discussed. The posterior boundaries on this of this surface obviously are the olfactory stria we can appreciate. So these are the posterior limits of the frontal lobe on the basal surface. So in this picture we can see the basal surfaces of the both sides. We can appreciate the gyri recti of both frontal lobes and the orbital gyri, which are lateral to the olfactory tract. So again, for showing the relationship between various structures, the frontal horn of the lateral ventricle has been labeled. This is the area superior to which or superficial to which the frontal horn would be located. This is the level of the foramen of Monro just anterior to the mammillary bodies if we go from superficial to deep relationship. Now in this picture the author has dissected off the basal part of the frontal lobe on one side, and he has shown that where the genu and where the ventricles are actually lying. You can see that this part of the frontal lobe was actually forming floor of the genu of the corpus callosum and floor of the frontal horn in this region. So if we would have dissected away this superficial structure, we would have landed in the region of the frontal horn and the basal ganglia. So this is the final part of my presentation today. This is about the relationship between the various skull sutures and the cerebral surfaces. Here the skull sutures which are left intact are the sagittal suture, the coronal suture, and the squamosal suture. Superior temporal line has also been left intact. We can appreciate the level of pterion where the squamosal suture, the coronal suture, and the frontosphenoid sutures actually meet. If we remove away the dura, then we can see that this coronal suture is very important. Why is it important? Because it helps us localize the motor strip. If you can see that the central sulcus takes a more posterior curve, so superiorly the central sulcus is far away from the coronal suture, about 3.5 to 4 centimeter behind the coronal suture. And when it comes down, it comes to like closely to the coronal suture. Another important point that is shown in this picture is that this author has again marked a nasoinial line over here, and this is the point when there's 50% or the midpoint of the nasoinial line. If you go 2 centimeter behind the nasoinial line, that is where your central sulcus seems to originate and go downward. So just 2 centimeter behind the nasoinial line, this is the area of the precentral gyrus, and if we take it in relation to the coronal suture, it's around 3 to 4.5 centimeter behind the coronal suture. Again, lambdoid squamosal sutures have been highlighted over as well. So this was regarding the anatomy of frontal and parietal lobes. I have tried to explain it as easy as possible. Kindly let me know regarding any queries. Thank you.